we'll be talking about the cost of manual compliance today and how Avalara can assist with that. So we'll move along to the agenda for today. All right, so we actually put out a survey to 500 different businesses, and we'll be talking about that today. We'll be sharing a great deal of stats from that survey. It'll address the company size and how that affects the sales tax management, as well as the industry and how that affects your tax compliance. And then obligations to register in other states. We'll talk about economic nexus, if you're familiar with that term. If not, we'll get into that as well. We'll talk about audits and the experiences that we gathered from our businesses that we surveyed. And finally, we'll talk about the adoption of new technologies as a result of all of the previous surveyed information that companies have gotten and how that leads to adoption of technologies. And then we will talk about how Avalara can help through sales tax automation. So with that, I will turn it over to Larry and he can take it from here.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, we're going to kick things off with the sales tax management survey that we undertook over the last year or two. Surveyed hundreds of businesses and got some really interesting results, especially in the emerging small business space, as well as the small and mid-sized business space. As we kind of walk through this data and the findings of the survey, I'd encourage you to really think of two primary questions. The first being, how much am I spending on sales and use tax and compliance in general today, both in terms of dollars as well as time? And then the follow-on question from that is, what projects or initiatives could I undertake if I had a solution in place where I could allocate that time and money elsewhere? This is really going to see a big impact and really the value of automation, especially the audit section and really the most common reasons for a negative audit finding. Spoiler alert, you'll find out that our core solutions address those in a quick and efficient manner, taking that risk off the plate. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in here. So the sales tax management survey, again, looked at hundreds of companies, looked at what they're doing today, looked at the number of returns filed as well as the frequency. And then really the kicker here is how many people and hours are devoted to sales tax compliance. It's traditionally an area that can trip up companies, but it's really not adding a lot of value in terms of ROI and growth for the business. So that's really where Avalara aims to step in and really take the menial and high risk portions of sales tax compliance off your plate so your high value employees can focus on more revenue generating activity and really leave the burdensome stuff to us.
And Larry, I just want to jump in here and mention, get really technical on you and mention some of the stats there that we actually, with this survey that we're going to be referring to throughout the presentation, there were 500 participants, and those were across the manufacturing, retail, software, and a couple other industries. But half of those were emerging small businesses and half are small, medium businesses. So, you know, the crowd will see that we're discussing this on both sides of the coin there when it comes to the participants. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks, Courtney. Yes, that was a great point to bring up, especially as we dive in. The survey was very precise, down to the exact dollar amount and number of hours across every industry. So we'll kind of dive into that here in a second and really have an idea of where each business really falls in line. And then kind of following on from today, we'll share some additional information about, you know, best practices, how businesses on the emerging small business side are leveraging our solutions that's flexible and scalable, as well as companies in the SMB space and even up to Fortune 500. We've got plenty of enterprise level customers utilizing our solutions, but it's tailored to their specific needs. So typically, how most businesses are handling compliance fall into 4 primary categories. Manually looking up rates through Google or each Department of Revenue website. You can see how that meets the muster for most businesses in the ESB space, where their obligations are small, but quickly you can see as your business grows in additional states and jurisdictions, how that can be burdensome as well as no longer sustainable. Another one is tax research. So that's moving away from rates, more looking at the taxability of your products and services. Additionally, you know, Some businesses have already made the decision, we want to move the menial tasks of sales and use tax compliance outside the company to a CPA firm. It's usually pretty costly and can be inefficient depending on your needs and the actual solution involved. The final line item here is really a combination of all three of those, whether that's manually looking up rates and outsourcing filings, for example, or just using research along with outsource, or all the above. Our solution is designed to be scalable and flexible to replace one or all of these depending on need and budget. All right, so let's dive into the data here. So this is dollars spent per month on each category. That's looking at sales tax, that's looking at consumer use tax, the amount of time and money devoted to filing preparation and remittance, management of exemption certificate, especially for your highly B2B or manufacturing businesses that are highly exempt, and then the tax rates and calculations as we discussed. So you can see across different industries, obligations vary, but we're looking at significant year-over-year expenditure, especially in the ESB space, to the tune of nearly 10K on average. And then as we move into the SMB space, significantly more year-over-year. All right, now contrasting ESB and SMB customers for the actual hours spent per month for each of those activities, tracking rates, tracking Nexus, filing preparation, management of exemption certificates. So especially in the SMB space, when we're looking at each state having a different exemption management renewal period, some don't require renewal, some are every 3 to 5 years, and then outliers like Florida require annual renewal. Hiring folks, highly educated, highly compensated individuals just devoted to collecting those compliance documents probably isn't the best use of their time, as well as the consumer use tax piece and tracking of rates and calculations. So significant monthly expenditure in terms of money and time. So I encourage you, especially on that second question that we led with, what projects could you take on if you could allocate that time and money elsewhere? All right, this is really a good breakdown when we're talking about adding headcount in order to take on some of these responsibilities, as well as employing external service providers. Avalara falls into the automation bucket here outside of these two, so where we can allow you to run more efficiently while removing risk and scaling with the business. It's cheaper than typically going with an external service provider, while also being more accurate and reducing your risk for kind of the human error component of sales and use tax compliance. All right, let's dive into cost per industry. So retailers spend the most amount of time, 209 hours per month, kind of across both the ESB and SMB spaces, as well as a little north of 24K each month on sales tax compliance. Manufacturing is a little bit less, mainly due to their obligations and the actual requirement to collect and remit. Most of that's focused on exemption management, and then software companies spend even less, but still 121 hours monthly is a significant time expenditure. All right, and this is the spend per month. Like we've discussed here, significant expenditures. And again, we're coming back to that point of if we could allocate that nearly 18K a month for the SMB space elsewhere, I'm sure, especially with COVID, with businesses who survived and thrived through the pandemic, a lot of them had to open up additional sales channels. If they're traditionally B2B business, launching an e-commerce website to go B2C was a huge undertaking. Where is that money going to come from? Typically, the savings in both time and money associated with sales and use tax compliance is where we saw a lot of that budget reallocation. Okay, now across industries, on average, we're looking at $2,100, almost $2,200 per month spent on external service providers by industry. That could be something as simple as just outsourcing filings. while your internal staff are researching rates and taxability, or all of the above. Manufacturing has the highest net spend there on a monthly basis, but we're looking at significant month over month. All right, now we're going to talk about Nexus, i.e. the obligations to register in other states. The biggest change in the sales and use tax landscape occurred in June of 2018 with the Supreme Court ruling in favor of the state of South Dakota against the online furniture retailer Wayfair. Since then, we've seen a cascade of new regulations and the establishment of economic nexus thresholds in every state at this point that has a sales tax regulation on the books. And then we'll talk about how that's evolved in what we'll call the Wayfair 2.0 for your online marketplaces. That's typically impacting businesses. Selling on Amazon FBA is really the most common one that we see, but there's a number, Walmart, Etsy, so on and so forth. So a lot of obligations, difficult to track, and we see it only as getting more and more complex. So economic nexus thresholds by state. A little background, as I mentioned, in June of 2018, a lot of these regulations flowed downstream from that initial ruling. How we've seen that even evolve since mid-June 2018 was the first economic thresholds were about $250,000 in taxable revenue and or 200 unique orders. So the states quickly recognized they were missing out on a lot of the B2B sellers and manufacturers. So a lot of them have lowered their thresholds to between $100,000 and $200,000 and looking at gross revenue rather than purely taxable. So these regulations are new, and even then they're constantly changing. Most businesses really should be tracking their nexus obligations beyond just economic nexus on a monthly, quarterly, or at a minimum annual basis, because the requirement to register, collect, and remit is highly important and can be a stumbling block, especially for new businesses.
Yeah, Larry, I just want to jump in and say one thing.
Sure.
I just want to hammer home one thing that you mentioned there, the fact that these thresholds are set up. If anyone on the call happens to be, B2B, perhaps a manufacturer, distributor, something of that nature, like Larry said, these thresholds are set up. They vary from state to state. And on top of that, each state is going to vary as to whether they count exempt sales as part of the threshold. So for years, many businesses didn't have to concern themselves with registrations and taxes and all of that stuff because they had exclusively exempt customers. But over the past 3 years, we've definitely seen a shift there. And many of the states have determined that regardless of whether your sales are taxable or not, you're going to have to register to collect there. So you did mention that, but I just wanted to make sure that was really hammered home.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And that brought me back to one critical component. Really, when I work with any business in terms of scoping out a solution, the first thing we do is we go through our free sales tax risk assessment, really establishing what your footprint is today, and also with a view to how is this going to change in the next 18 to 24 to 36 months. Because really, at Avalara, we're looking to audit proof your business, whether we do all of the compliance from calculation, management of documents to filings, or start small, just handle one of those and then scale up as your business grows. We want to make sure that we are audit proofing as we go and that we're taking everything that could hinder the growth of your business from a sales and use tax standpoint off your plate, so you can allocate that money and time elsewhere. So we've talked about Nexus. So where do I need to register and collect as being a challenge? Another arguably more difficult to track challenge is product taxability. So how are your products and services viewed in every state, every city, every county? Because it can vary widely, especially when we talk about home rule states like Colorado or Louisiana, where local jurisdictions beyond just the state level have a huge amount of taxing authority. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the sales and use tax compliance landscape. For example, let's look at powder drink mixes in the state of New York. Kool-Aid would be a taxable product. Tang, for whatever reason, would be non-taxable. How is your business if you are in that space, tracking those changes, because it could easily flip the other way. Our solution, through our implementation process, automates that process entirely. So it runs in the background, and it's actually the only solution that's certified, guaranteed, accurate. You can sleep well at night knowing that this product taxability and the treatment of Kool-Aid versus Tang, we've got it covered. All right, let's move on to Wayfair 2.0, which is the marketplace seller regulations. 45 states have now adopted them. The last 3 were Kansas, Florida, and Missouri. So really, one of the most common issues that we see with businesses selling on marketplaces, as I alluded to, was Amazon FBA. Reason being, each marketplace is choosing how it meets its new requirements differently. So for example, Amazon is not going to register your business, but they will collect and remit on your behalf. Now, what the tricky piece with that is storing inventory in a warehouse. And if you're using the Amazon FBA program today, you don't have the ability to determine where your inventory is housed. It can be moved state to state. And with Amazon collecting and remitting on your behalf, the states are really sitting back and waiting for businesses to look at where their inventory is located and register, because the states are already getting the data from Amazon. So it's really something to stay on top of through that Amazon inventory report, which again, if you have questions on that, I'm happy to assist, but that's really where we're seeing a ton of complexity. All right, and just know that states are refining their laws as they've done for Wayfair and Economic Nexus. So those requirements are constantly in flux.
Yeah, I was going to pop in here again, just to mention, and I don't know if this is redundant, if you already kind of covered this, but we keep mentioning Wayfair, and I just wanted to define that a little further. There was a quintessential case in 2018 that sort of was the cornerstone for Economic Nexus, this term that we keep mentioning. Prior to that, it was just kind of dependent on physical presence, but the state of South Dakota took that business Wayfair that we all know, the furniture company, and South Dakota won. And they were kind of the trailblazer when it came to setting these thresholds, and all of the other states followed suit. So when we're mentioning Wayfair, that's what we're talking about. And sorry, Larry, if you already mentioned that, but just wanted to dive in.
No, thanks, Courtney. That's great. All right. So selling via e-commerce or online marketplaces. This slide is great. It just speaks to the complexity. Each state's different, how each state is looking at Economic Nexus versus selling on marketplaces. And then also for those marketplaces themselves have their own challenges. So we've talked about kind of the big ones, but there are numerous marketplaces that have just as much complexity but aren't as well known. So that's also another avenue that we scope out during the initial discovery phase. Other Nexus triggers, affiliate Nexus is important as well. Same thing with click-through Nexus. Don't worry about what those mean too much as of right now. Just know that there's a lot of complexity here. We can assist you making sense of all this stuff. One of the benefits of working with Avalara is we have an in-house tax advisory team. It's about a dozen former state auditors who are experts in all this stuff and can give you a view to what your obligations are moving forward, as well as any historic liability. Have you maybe triggered Nexus but didn't know it going back a couple years? How do we get in the good graces of the states? Things of that nature. That's what we do. Really at Avalara, we're the only vendor in the space that has every piece of your compliance need covered. There's nothing that we would need to outsource to a third party. All right, level of understanding of sales tax compliance. We see a higher percentage here in the emerging small business space. That's typically due to company size. They've got a good handle on the state where they're headquartered and likely have not grown beyond that Nexus footprint. Wayfair probably isn't in scope for them just yet. Now we see in the SMB space, that percentage starts to drop a little bit. Uncertainty tends to go up as we're looking at high growth companies and their obligations in additional states that they're not used to. So that's really where we help out the most in the initial scoping. Let's get into audit liability. All right, so in terms of money and time, audits are a pain. On average, 35 hours of preparation and response time. It's not uncommon, especially for businesses with mostly manual processes, especially on the exemption management side of the house. Those manufacturers and mostly B2B sellers, the preparation time typically goes well beyond the 35 hours. When we talk about management of exemption documents, especially across multiple states, the pain of being notified that your business is being audited and then having to go out to each of your customers who are exempt and collecting new documents is very time consuming, as well as high risk, because auditors themselves tell us that's the low hanging fruit for them, because they know most B2B businesses are not fully compliant in their exemption management program. So that's a big area where we can help. And then also 14% of all companies surveyed across the hundreds and wide array of industries experienced some sales tax audit in the past 5 years. 79% of those audits were completed within 3 weeks. Another wrinkle here is with COVID, we saw a decrease in the number of audits. However, as all businesses have transitioned in the pandemic environment, we started seeing a major uptick in online and call them remote audits. So we all use Zoom and Teams for meetings. Auditors are now using that as well to really ramp back up the audit activity. So it's really important to revisit some of these high risk, we'll call it, areas of the sales and use tax landscape. Think of those: tracking taxability, tracking your Nexus, as well as the exemption management, areas of need for most businesses. All right. Average spend for responding to and managing the audit process. Obviously, the obligations for SMB are significantly higher. That's usually hand in hand with how many states they have Nexus in, because typically what we see is where there's one audit, there's typically 3 or 4. Auditors communicate state to state. So this is pretty regular, where you can expect one audit, probably be on the lookout for another 2 in the next 12 to 18 months. Versus the ESB space, still a significant expenditure when we look at overall revenue, but the net spend there is significantly less than the SMB space. All right, I mentioned at the beginning of the call that the reasons for audit penalties and negative findings really go hand in hand with our core business platforms. Sales tax rate or rule errors, that's incorrect application of the rate, as well as the taxability challenges and tracking how your products and services are viewed in any given jurisdiction. This is the area where our engine Avatax, I mentioned we're the only vendor that has a certified guaranteed accurate calc. This is where that's leveraged the most. And on average, 0.4 of a second, we're guaranteeing we're capturing the correct rate, making the correct taxability decision, as well as checking the exemption status of your customer. That's the only guaranteed accurate calc on the market, and that addresses 48% of reasons for audit penalties through back-end automation there. Missing exemption certificates. That includes exemption certificates that have expired. Maybe they're the incorrect form, they're not complete, meaning they're missing a tax ID number, or maybe your customer didn't sign it correctly. 41% is a huge number. And again, that speaks to our Cert Capture exemption certificate management platform. It's the best in the business. And then filings, late filings is 37%. Like we guarantee accuracy with calculation, if Avalara is doing your filings, we guarantee you will not file late. Really, what we need to know is what states you need to file in, including local jurisdictions, and how frequently, and then we handle the rest from there. These last 2 are just as important. Failure to register and file into states where you have Nexus. This gets to that Nexus tracking piece. Our solution, especially if we're doing calculations for you, is going to track your economic Nexus obligations in real time and flag states in a bright orange heat map as you meet or exceed thresholds. We'll notify you when you've met those requirements and then recommend registrations, whether you pursue that registration in-house or you outsource that to us as well. And then finally, consumer use tax liabilities. They're the lowest percentage of audit penalties, but I will say from customer feedback that we've received, those tend to be the high dollar penalties as well. Consumer use tax is difficult to automate, but we have really the first primary platform in the industry. It's called Avalara for consumer use, to work with you to automate that process, identify gaps, and then cover those gaps without necessarily needing to add headcount or devote additional time and resources to that. All right, adoption of new technologies. This is where the IT spend and automation really takes over. So this is from that same survey. We asked the likelihood of businesses for purchasing new tax technology within the next 12 months. Somewhat likely, much more likely, basically as Nexus obligations grow from the ESB space, where they're typically a smaller footprint, to the SMB, we're seeing a trend towards automation. Really, those Nexus obligations and sales and use tax requirements are quickly, as businesses are growing, expanding beyond the capacity of their internal resources. So that's where we come in. All right, overall results of the survey. More than half of the finance and accountants said keeping up with those changes, especially with online sales and technology, was highly important to them, mainly because it's a huge part of their day. 54% of those accountants indicated their own companies could benefit from it. So really, I would say this is an important takeaway. The end users dealing with sales tax see the need for automation. Avalara steps in to really figure out where is the most ROI going to be found with automation. Is it with an end-to-end solution right out of the gate? Or do we scale up? Do we select one area of need and then roll in additional capability as the business continues to grow? We're designed to be scalable and flexible and work with you. We have a 98% customer retention rating for a reason. As soon as businesses start using one or more of our capabilities, they see the value in it. That ROI is clear for them, and they typically add on to that service and continue to outsource more and more of their compliance to us. All right, sales tax automation. Why do most businesses choose to automate sales tax? As I mentioned, we are more accurate than the manual solution. We do it in real time. As states and local jurisdictions change their rates, change their taxability rules, through our cloud-based engine, we push those updates in real time. There is no need for any user intervention to track rates and taxability anymore. It's more efficient. It reduces the cost and the time devoted to tracking all those changes and obligations. Customer satisfaction tends to go through the roof as well. When you talk about calculation in and of itself, the risk of either over collecting from a customer and dealing with that negative customer experience goes away entirely. And on the flip side, under collecting, where you're in hot water with the states, goes away entirely as well. Goes hand in hand with risk management. We know we're guaranteeing the calculation is done correctly each and every time. So when we flow downstream from there with filings, with audits, the amount of time devoted to sales and use tax compliance goes down, while the audit risk goes down as well. Business growth, kind of as I've been mentioning, if you could free up those resources currently devoted to the menial tasks of sales tax compliance, where would you spend that money? Where would you allocate those resources? The answer should be Avalara's end-to-end tax compliance solution for all of your compliance needs. So we've been talking specifically about sales tax today, especially through the lens of that survey. But that really only covers the first three areas that we address. Through strategic acquisitions, as well as new technology that we've rolled out, we can now address business licenses. So beyond just sales tax registrations, for construction industries, we can help with permitting. For your BevAlc businesses, we can assist, as you're opening new locations, we can help with the full end-to-end licensing need there as well as the back-end sales and use tax compliance. We've got consumer use solutions for the fiscal side, insights, that's the ongoing tracking of Nexus and your overall obligations, as well as looking at historical liability. If you are concerned about, hey, maybe we did trigger Nexus a couple years ago, but we just never addressed it. Now, as we're automating and getting fully compliant, we have this elephant in the room that we need to address and hopefully take care of so we can then move forward with a clean slate. All of that we handle in-house to also include for international sales. We can handle all of your VAT calculations and filings. We can handle even customs and duties. So especially for your e-commerce businesses, when you're trying to sell into the EU or just anywhere globally, getting your products to your customers, as well as having your customer knowing at checkout what that landed cost looks like, is a critical piece of feedback that we've gotten. Customers want to know what they're paying for customs and duties, as well as you getting your products to that customer quickly and efficiently and not having those sometimes weeks-long hold up in customs. We are now a full compliance suite, not just sales and use tax. I know we've been talking about sales and use tax today, but we can handle so much more. All right, we'll go ahead and stop there. I know we've covered a ton of ground. I'm going to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Larry. It looks like we don't have any questions at the moment. Is there anything else you want to go over?
Our solution is scalable for any size business. I've worked with brand new e-commerce startups all the way up through publicly traded companies, everyone in between. I've been on the Microsoft Dynamics team here at Avalara for almost 3 years, worked with hundreds of customers. Love working with the TM group and their customers as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Larry and Courtney. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now. So thanks again for being here today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.